I'm Mr. Beat. Today, when the suffix gate is at the end of something, you know it's bad, man. Travelgate, Coingate, ClimateGate, Nipplegate, Bountygate, Gamergate, Deflategate, Pizzagate, Sharpiegate, Slapgate, Fartgate. Basically, if gate is at the end of a noun, it suggests that there is some widespread scandal or controversy going on. For example, let's take Fartgate. Yes, it was a real thing.
A lot of people have written me about this Fartgate.
When I woke up this morning, hashtag Fartgate was still trending.
So the controversy was that someone clearly farted on the air when MSNBC's Chris Matthews was interviewing Congressman Eric Swalwell
from cheating an election.
But to this day, no one has admitted to doing the farting. For the record, I think it was Swalwell who farted. Just saying. Anyway, how did this whole thing where you add gate to describe any controversy or scandal begin? Well, that's simple. It was the Watergate scandal.
Hey, hello? Hey, what was the Watergate scandal?
You really want to know?
Yes.
You really think you can handle this?
Yes.
Fine, let's do this. Here is the story of the Watergate scandal. Once upon a time, well, on June 17th, 1972, to be exact, 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C.
Oh, is that why it's called Watergate?
Yes, that's why it's called Watergate. Anyway, the 5 men tried to set up a wiretap and photograph confidential Democratic Party documents. Well, Forrest Gump called up a Watergate security guard named Frank Wills and told him about it.
The lights are off and they must be looking for a fuse box or something because them flashlights, they're keeping me awake.
Just kidding. That was just a movie. Forrest Gump is not real. He's a fake. He's never existed. Fabricated. But Tom Hanks is real, and thank goodness for that. Anyway, Frank Wills actually noticed tape covering the latches on some of Watergate's doors, which allowed the doors to close but stay unlocked. He called the police, and they promptly came and arrested the men. Little did most know that these men were connected with the Committee for the Reelection of the President, or the CRP, or CREEP.
Did you call me a creep?
No, I did not. What the heck are you doing here?
I don't belong here.
The CRP was officially a fundraising organization to get Richard Nixon reelected. Unofficially, they did all kinds of illegal stuff. You know, stuff like breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The 5 men arrested were Virgilio Gonzalez, Bernard Barker, James McCord, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis. 4 of them were Cuban exiles. They were charged with attempted burglary and attempted interception of communications, basically trying to spy and stuff. 3 reporters at the Washington Post, Alfred Lewis, Carl Bernstein, and Bob Woodward, covered the arrests. But later, Bernstein and Woodward decided to do a little more digging and soon discovered that 2 other dudes were involved with the burglary. Everett Howard Hunt, a former CIA officer, and George Gordon Liddy, a former FBI agent. And both were creeps. I mean, they worked for CREEP, or the CRP, or the Committee for the Reelection of the President. And so did James McCord. As a matter of fact, Bernstein and Woodward also discovered that the 4 Cuban exiles who broke into Watergate had previously worked with the CIA, with Hunt in particular. Well, Bernstein and Woodward had a little help. A mysterious person began providing them important information. Sometimes he called, and sometimes Woodward would meet him in a dark parking garage. The person claimed he was an FBI agent himself, and a Washington Post editor later jokingly referred to him simply as Deep Throat.
Deep Throat?
Hey, watch your mouth, sonny boy. Soon, everyone was calling him Deep Throat. As it turns out, the FBI had an investigation into the Watergate break-in too, and boy was it juicy. For starters, they had found a check made out to the CRP for $25,000 actually deposited in the bank accounts of one of the Watergate burglars, Bernard Barker. Soon, the FBI and Bernstein and Woodward had also found out that Hunt and Liddy were destroying all evidence that linked the 5 men who broke into Watergate to not only the CRP, but to President Richard Nixon himself. Oh, and the higher-ups were involved. Liddy's boss, Jeb Magruder, in on the cover-up. Even John N. Mitchell, who not only led the CRP, but was recently the Attorney General in the Nixon administration, was in on the cover-up. There's no way to know for sure if Nixon knew all about the shady stuff that the CRP was doing, but once he found out that the CRP was connected to Watergate, he promptly met with his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, to figure out how to cover it up.
Wouldn't that make things worse?
Absolutely. Once Nixon and his administration realized the press were looking into them being involved with the Watergate break-in, they immediately began to distance themselves. Nixon's press secretary, Ron Ziegler, said the president had no comment on a, quote, third-rate burglary attempt. Nixon ran a public relations campaign to insist he nor his administration, nor even the CRP, were connected to it at all. John Mitchell went as far as having his wife kind of kidnapped so she wouldn't talk to the press about what she knew about the break-in? I'm serious. Now, Nixon was obviously more concerned about the FBI investigation, and especially more concerned that the FBI was apparently working with Bernstein and Woodward. He met with Haldeman and told him to have the CIA pressure the FBI into dropping its Watergate investigation. Oh, this was a recorded conversation, by the way. It was on tape. Crazy enough, the FBI went along with it. For a little while, at least. And while Bernstein and Woodward never lost focus, continuing to publish stories describing the CRP's dirty tricks, most of the media did lose focus, and Nixon easily won re-election in November. The Watergate break-in had hardly any effect on the presidential election of 1972. But despite the landslide victory for Nixon, Watergate wasn't going to fade away anytime soon. Around the same time that Nixon was inaugurated, the trial of the Watergate burglars began, with Judge John Sirica presiding. Nixon had a close eye on the trial, meeting with his advisors, the Johns, about concerns that the dudes on trial might speak to the press. John Dean, the White House counsel, and John Ehrlichman, the assistant to the president for domestic affairs. On January 30th, 1973, the Watergate burglars pled guilty or were convicted for conspiracy, burglary, and violation of federal wiretapping laws. Judge Sirica, however, suspected there was a major cover-up and that the CRP or the president had to know all about the Watergate break-in. His suspicions were confirmed after James McCord wrote a letter to him implicating Nixon and his advisors in the cover-up. Nixon was like, I knew one of them would try this crap, and called an emergency meeting with John Dean again. Dean urged Nixon to come clean, that the only way to keep everyone else quiet was to pay them off with $1 million. Nixon replied, and this is on tape. It's on tape.
It's on tape?
It's on tape. Nixon replied, you could get $1 million and you could get it in cash. I know where it could be gotten. In other words, Nixon had no intention of ever coming clean on this. Nixon later tried to make it seem he was kidding when he talked about the $1 million. But regardless, when it was clear Dean wasn't going along with Nixon, Nixon fired him on April 30th, 1973. Well, Dean had been working with the FBI by that time anyway. Shortly afterward, even though Ehrlichman and Haldeman seemed to still be on board with Nixon, they resigned. Well, after Nixon pressured them to, and so did 4 other Nixon advisors. By now, top officials in the CRP like Jeb Magruder and even John Mitchell were facing indictment. And to attempt to calm down the press, which all of a sudden was now paying close attention, Nixon announced that he was not involved with Watergate at all. Well, that didn't ease the minds of the United States Senate. In May, it formed the Watergate Committee, chaired by the respected North Carolina Senator Sam Ervin. Former Nixon aides told the committee that lots of crimes had happened before the 1972 election intended to undermine the president's opponents. Well, Nixon appointed a Harvard law professor named Archibald Cox to lead a separate independent investigation. In June, the Watergate Committee called in John Dean. The Tennessee Senator Howard Baker famously asked, quote, "What did the president know and when did he know it?" Dean spilled the beans. He said he had talked with Nixon about the Watergate cover-up many, many times, and that Nixon refused to come clean about it. Nixon was like, "Nah, man, fake news. Dean was making all that stuff up." But Americans soon found out that there was a new system in the White House that automatically recorded everything in the Oval Office and Cabinet Room. So if Nixon was in on the Watergate break-in, or even if he just knew about it and was trying to cover it up, there could be evidence of it in the recordings. Archibald Cox, as well as the Senate, immediately subpoenaed the White House recordings. However, Nixon refused to release them, citing his, quote, executive privilege as the president. He even ordered Cox to drop his subpoena, but Cox refused. In response, on Saturday, October 20th, 1973, Nixon told his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Well, Richardson refused and immediately resigned. So Nixon then told Richardson's next in command, Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus, to fire him. Well, Ruckelshaus also refused and also resigned. So Nixon then told Ruckelshaus's next in command, Robert Bork, to fire him, and Bork was like, "Okay, fine, I'll fire him." This whole fiasco became known as the Saturday Night Massacre.
A massacre? That doesn't make Nixon very good, does it?
No siree. And many Americans began to protest. And after lots of public pressure, Nixon finally agreed to release the tapes. Well, some of them, at least. Judge Sirica asked for 9 tapes. Nixon gave him 7. And one of those 7 tapes had a big gap of 18.5 minutes on it that experts say could not have happened accidentally. That was one of the conversations with, you probably guessed it, John Dean. In November, Nixon made a now famous proclamation.
"Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got."
Still, by early 1974, it seemed pretty clear that President Nixon had at least known about the Watergate break-in and tried to cover it up. There was just little solid evidence to prove it. On March 1st, 1974, a grand jury indicted 7 former aides of Nixon, who later simply became known as the, quote, Watergate 7. That group included the aforementioned John Mitchell, Bob Haldeman, and John Ehrlichman, but additionally Charles Colson, Gordon Strawn, Robert Mardian, and Kenneth Parkinson. In April, the dude who took Cox's place to investigate the Watergate break-in, Leon Jaworski, had another subpoena ordering Nixon to release 64 additional tapes of his conversations in the Oval Office. Well, instead of releasing the tapes, Nixon just gave them edited transcripts of some of the conversations. Nixon even asked Judge John Sirica to reverse the subpoena, but Sirica denied the motion, saying Nixon had until May 31st to turn over the tapes. Well, this turned into a major Supreme Court case, which is called the United States v. Nixon. As it just so happens, I recently made a video about it, and you can check it out right now if you want to. Just remember to come back. Say, have you watched it yet, Stephen? Never mind. Long story short,
Watched what?
Nixon lost that case. Not only had Nixon lost that case, but now it also looked like the House of Representatives was going to impeach him on the charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Woe-ness. Not only that, Bernstein and Woodward had now even published an entire book that went over their reporting into the whole Watergate scandal that later became a movie. By August, 57% of Americans wanted Nixon removed from office. Feeling the pressure like never before and worried about further disgrace, Nixon announced his resignation on August 8th, 1974.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
He became the first, and to this date, only president in American history to quit the job. The man who replaced him as president, Gerald Ford, later gave him a full pardon, so Nixon never faced any criminal punishment. For the rest of his life, he maintained his innocence. But others in his administration? Yeah, that's a different story. In total, 69 people were indicted and 48 people convicted for either participating in, aiding in, or covering up information about the Watergate break-in. Again, many of these folks were top Nixon administration officials. Some top dogs even ended up serving prison time. Most of the 48 convicted served prison time. Congress moved to further reduce the power of the presidency, passing laws like the Privacy Act and creating committees to oversee the shenanigans of executive branch agencies. In 2005, Americans learned that Deep Throat, you know, the dude who provided Bernstein and Woodward all the important information for the reporting, was an FBI agent named Mark Felt.
Wait, so his real name wasn't Deep Throat?
I'm afraid not. The Watergate scandal is arguably the biggest political scandal in American history. It led to a major setback for the Republican Party, especially as they lost many seats in Congress in the 1974 midterm elections. Watergate dramatically increased cynicism and distrust of the federal government, which had already been on the rise due to its lies revolving around the Vietnam War. But it also proved that the American system of checks and balances actually worked. The judicial and legislative branches were able to fight corruption within the executive branch. And ever since, the presidents have been a bit more cautious, I'd argue. Well, most of them have been a bit more cautious. We'll leave it at that. So if Watergate happened today, would Americans react differently? I think we would, because compared to the 1970s, today we're much more divided and partisan, unfortunately. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. If you're watching this video right now and you're looking for a free tutor, or you want to become a tutor yourself, I recommend the organization Connect Me. They are a nonprofit that provides free tutoring services for students in grades kindergarten all the way up to 8th grade. And I think they're doing fantastic work. If you want to check them out, I've also put a link to their organization in the description of this video. And finally, a shout out to my brother Steven. Thank you, Steven, for helping me make this video. I know I always bug you, but you always say yes when I ask you to do these things. So thank you. You're the best brother in the world. And thank you for watching.